The Grand Hall of Ascension was carved from the bones of a dead moon, and it was the largest structure ever built by any living species in the known galaxy. Every 10 standard years, the leaders of 42 spacefaring civilizations gathered inside that hall to perform a ritual older than most of their empires. The Rite of Standing. The rite was simple in concept, but brutal in consequence. Every species sent its supreme military commander to stand before the Dominion Council and declare their rank, their record, and their right to hold sovereign territory in the galaxy. If the commander was strong enough, the species kept its worlds, its trade routes, and its voice in the council. If the commander was found lacking, the species was reclassified, stripped of voting rights, denied territorial sovereignty, and offered as a vassal to whatever stronger power wanted to claim them. Rank was everything in the Dominion. Rank was law, survival. And no one understood that truth more deeply than General Tharok Volkan. Tharok was a Sithari, a species of massive reptilian predators from a high-gravity death world, where everything that lived had learned to kill before it could walk. He stood 3 meters tall, his scales the color of hammered bronze, his arms thick as tree trunks, his jaw wide enough to crush a smaller species' skull in a single bite. Across his chest and shoulders, he wore the ceremonial bones of rivals he had killed in sanctioned combat duels, 17 in total, each one a general or warlord from a different species who had dared to challenge his supremacy. He had held the title of Apex Marshal of the Dominion military for 80 standard years, longer than any being in recorded history, and in all that time, no one had come close to taking it from him. He sat now on the Apex throne at the center of the Grand Hall, watching the delegations arrive one by one. The massive arched gates at the far end of the chamber. The Felnari came first, tall feline warriors with golden fur and vertical slit pupils, moving with the liquid grace of born predators, their supreme fang draped in a cloak of enemy pelts. Then the Chirics, insectoid beings with gleaming black exoskeletons and compound eyes that reflected the light like shattered mirrors, their hive commander clicking and buzzing in a language that sounded like breaking glass. Then the Drenak, the Volundri, the Korath, the Palasine, and dozens more, each species grander and louder than the last, each commander dripping with medals and kill marks and ceremonial weapons designed to say one thing without words: I am powerful and you should be afraid. Tharok watched them all with the bored patience of a predator who had long since stopped seeing anything in the room as a threat. Then the message came. A junior Sithari officer approached the Apex throne and knelt, holding up a datapad. Apex Marshal, the officer said, the human delegation has requested landing clearance. Tharok's eyes moved slowly to the officer. Humans. He had heard of them, a young species from a distant spiral arm, barely a few thousand years into their civilized history, only recently unified enough to even qualify for Dominion recognition. They were small, soft, short-lived, and apparently spent most of their existence fighting each other over patches of dirt on a single, unremarkable planet. The intelligence reports described them as technologically derivative and strategically incoherent. Tharok made a sound deep in his throat, not quite a laugh, not quite a growl, and stamped the landing clearance with one massive clawed thumb. Let them come, he said, and the words carried the weight of someone who had already decided the newcomers were beneath his attention. Word spread quickly through the Grand Hall. Humans were coming. For most of the assembled species, this was entertainment, a chance to see what kind of absurd little creature the youngest civilization in the galaxy would send to stand before the Apex Marshal. The Felnari ambassador, a sleek female named Tessera, with silver-tipped fur and eyes like molten copper, leaned toward her aide and purred with amusement. "What do you think they will send?" she asked, her tail flicking lazily behind her. Her aide, A younger male with darker fur shrugged. "Probably some old male with a chest full of medals he gave himself," he said. Tessera laughed, a sound like silk tearing. Around them other delegations were making similar jokes. The Chirix hive commander turned its segmented head toward its subordinates, and made a rapid series of clicks that translated roughly to entertainment before the real business begins. The Drenak general, a massive creature that looked like a bear crossed with a shark, simply grunted and said, "Fresh meat." Even the Koroth, a normally reserved aquatic species who conducted diplomacy from within portable water tanks, were exchanging amused burbles through their translation membranes. Only one delegation did not laugh: the Velundri. They were among the oldest species in the Dominion, enormous beings that resembled the elephants of Earth, if elephants had been redesigned by a god with a fondness for wisdom and sorrow. Their skin was thick and gray, covered in intricate natural patterns that deepened and grew more complex with age, and their eyes, small for their massive heads, held a depth that most younger species found unsettling. The Velundri ambassador was named Uranthu, and he was very old. Old enough to remember wars that the other species had forgotten. Old enough to have watched empires rise and crumble, and be replaced by empires that did not even know the names of what had come before. He stood at the back of the grand hall, his great bulk casting a shadow over the smaller beings around him, and he watched the view screens that showed the human ship descending through the atmosphere of Tyrannus Prime. The ship was small. It was not a dreadnought bristling with weapons. It was not a flagship surrounded by an escort fleet. It was a single matte black vessel, angular and plain, with no visible armaments and no identifying marks beyond a simple serial number on the hull. Uranthu watched it descend, and he said nothing. His aide, a younger Velundri barely 2 centuries old, shifted nervously beside him. "Ambassador," the aide said quietly, "you seem troubled." Uranthu did not look away from the screen. "I met a human once," he said, his voice so deep it vibrated in the bones of everyone standing nearby. "When?" the aide asked. "A long time ago," Uranthu said, "during the fringe conflicts. Species was still isolated and unknown." "And what were they like?" Uranthu was quiet for a long moment. The human ship touched down on the landing pad, and through the view screen they could see the ramp beginning to lower. "Quiet," Uranthu said finally. His aide waited for more, but the old ambassador had turned his gaze toward the grand hall's main entrance, where the human delegation would soon appear, and his ancient eyes held something that none of the laughing, joking, sneering species around him seemed to feel. Something that looked very much like caution. The landing pad was wide enough to hold a warship 10 times the size of the one that had just touched down, and the emptiness around the small black vessel made it look even smaller than it was. A Sithari honor guard of 12 soldiers stood in 2 rigid lines along the walkway leading from the pad to the main corridor, their scales polished to a mirror shine, their ceremonial halberds held perfectly upright, their eyes locked forward with the discipline of beings who had trained since birth for exactly this kind of duty. Behind them, a loose crowd of diplomatic aides, junior officers, and curious onlookers from half a dozen species had gathered at a respectful distance to watch the humans arrive. The ramp of the human ship lowered slowly. There was no smoke, no dramatic lighting, no fanfare of any kind. Just the quiet hiss of hydraulics and the dull thud of metal touching stone. 8 figures descended. They were human soldiers, all of them, in identical dark uniforms that had no ornamentation whatsoever. No medals, no colored sashes, no rank insignia beyond small patches on their shoulders that the watching aliens could not read at this distance. They moved in perfect synchronization, their steps landing at exactly the same moment, their spacing precise to the centimeter, their faces calm and unreadable. The Sithari honor guard watched them approach, and for the first time, several of the guards allowed their eyes to move, just slightly, because there was something about the way these humans walked that did not match what they had been told to expect. They had been told the humans were soft. They had been told the humans were small and weak and disorganized. These 8 figures moved like a single organism, not with the stiff mechanical precision of parade ground soldiers, but with the fluid, unhurried certainty of predators who knew exactly where they were going and exactly what they would do when they got there. And at the center of the 8 walked a woman. She was not tall, barely over average height even by human standards, which made her small enough that the Sci-Fi guards could have looked over her head without tilting their necks. She was not broad, or muscular, or physically imposing in any way that the watching aliens could identify. She wore the same plain dark uniform as her soldiers, with a single silver star on her collar, and nothing else, no medals, no decorations, no ceremonial weapon at her hip. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly from her face, and her face itself was calm in a way that went beyond composure. It was not the face of someone controlling their emotions. It was the face of someone who simply had no emotions that needed controlling in this moment. Her name was Lyra Vasek, and she was a commander in the United Human Defense Force. The delegation reached the end of the landing pad, where the walkway began, and the lead Sci-Fi guard stepped forward. He was large even by Sci-Fi standards, nearly 3 meters of scaled muscle and bone, and he held a ceremonial halberd that was taller than any of the humans in front of him. He looked down at Lyra with an expression that mixed contempt with professional duty. "Identify yourself," he said, his voice a low rumble that the translation devices in the humans' ears converted to flat, accented English. "State your rank, and present your certification of supreme military authority." Lyra looked up at him the way someone might look at a door that needed to be opened, without hostility, without fear, without any particular emotion at all. "Commander Lyra Vasek," she said, "United Human Defense Force." One of her soldiers, a tall man with gray at his temples, stepped forward and held out a datapad. The Sci-Fi guard took it, scanned it with a device mounted on his wrist, and frowned. Again. Then he looked down at Lyra with something new in his eyes. Not contempt this time, but confusion that was rapidly turning into irritation. "This lists your rank as commander," he said. "That is correct," Lyra said. "The right of standing requires the supreme military leader of a species," the guard said, and his voice had dropped lower, which in Sci-Fi body language meant he was issuing a warning. A commander is a mid-level rank in most military structures, and presenting a mid-level officer for the right is considered an insult to the Grand Hall and to the Apex Marshal personally. "I understand," Lyra said. The guard waited for her to say something else, to explain, to apologize, to reveal that she was actually a much higher rank traveling in disguise, or that a more important leader was coming behind her. She said nothing. She simply stood there, looking up at him, her hands clasped loosely behind her back, expression unchanged. The guard's frill, a ridge of scaled skin along the back of his neck that Sci-Fi raised involuntarily when agitated, began to rise. "You understand," he repeated flatly. "Yes," Lyra said. "I am what my people sent, and I am enough." The words were simple and spoken quietly, but something about them made 2 of the other Sci-Fi guards glance at each other, a quick, almost involuntary look that said neither of them could quite explain what they were feeling. The lead guard stared at Lyra for several more seconds. Then he stepped aside, because his orders were to verify identity and allow passage, and she had been verified. But he activated his communicator as the human delegation walked past and sent a message ahead to the Grand Hall. "The human delegation is en route," he said. "They have sent a commander, not a general, not a supreme leader, a commander, and she carries no visible weapons, no ceremonial honors, and no kill marks of any kind." He paused, searching for the right words. "She is either a fool," he said, "or something I do not have a word for." The human delegation moved down the corridor in the same perfect formation. Lyra at the center, her soldiers around her like a living shield that did not look like a shield because none of them had their hands anywhere near their weapons. The corridor was long and lined with ancient stone carvings that depicted great military victories of the Dominion's founding species. Massive battles, burning worlds, commanders standing atop mountains of their enemies' dead. Lyra did not look at any of them. She walked forward with the steady pace of someone who had walked into far worse places than this and walked out again. Halfway down the corridor, in the shadow of a carved pillar 3 times her height, a small shape watched her pass. It was a Felnari cub, barely old enough to walk upright, with soft golden fur and enormous amber eyes that had not yet learned the narrowed, guarded look of adults. The cub was the child of a junior Felnari diplomatic aide who had brought the young one along, because arrangements for care had fallen through at the last moment, and the aide had strict orders not to miss the rite. The cub had been told to stay hidden and stay quiet, and it had obeyed through the Sithari delegation, through the Kyrix, through the Drenak and all the others. But now, as the human woman walked past, the cub went still. Not the stillness of a child being obedient, but the stillness of a small predator that had just caught the scent of something far, far above it on the chain of life. The cub's tiny nostrils flared. Its fur rose along its spine, not in fear exactly, but in the deep biological recognition that something in its ancient instincts had just woken up and was paying very close attention. The cub's mouth opened slightly, came out. It pressed itself deeper into the shadow of the pillar, and watched Lyra Vasic disappear down the corridor toward the grand hall. And its small heart beat so fast that it could feel the pulse in its ears. It did not understand what it had just sensed. It only knew, in the wordless, absolute way, that young Felnari knew things before society taught them to doubt their instincts. That the quiet woman in the dark uniform was the most dangerous thing it had ever been near. And it was not even close. The Grand Hall of Ascension could hold 10,000 beings comfortably, and today it held nearly 12,000, because word of the human delegation had spread, and no one wanted to miss the spectacle. The chamber was circular, rising in tiered rings of stone seating from the central floor to a domed ceiling so high above that clouds sometimes formed near the top during long sessions. Every seat was filled. Sithari generals in bone armor sat beside Chiric's hive officers, whose compound eyes reflected the light of the ceremonial torches in 1,000 fractured pieces. Felnari commanders reclined, with the lazy confidence of cats who knew they were dangerous, their tails curling and uncurling behind them. Drenak warlords sat hunched forward, with their massive arms resting on their knees, watching the central floor with the hungry patience of creatures who had evolved to wait for prey. Korath admirals floated in their portable water tanks, translucent bodies pulsing with bioluminescent signals that conveyed emotions their vocal translators could not capture. And at the center of it all, elevated on a platform of black stone, sat General Tharok Vulcan on the apex throne. He had not moved since the session began. He sat with the absolute stillness of a predator who had learned long ago that movement was wasted energy. And his golden eyes, slit-pupilled and cold, tracked every delegation that entered with the mechanical precision of targeting systems. 39 species had already completed their rite of standing. 39 supreme military commanders had walked to the center of the floor, declared their rank, presented their records, and submitted to Tharok's assessment. Some had been praised, some had been dismissed with contempt. 2 had been openly mocked, their species downgraded in the Dominion's hierarchy on the spot, while their allies looked away and pretended not to. Notice. Now the 40th delegation was about to enter. The massive gates at the far end of the hall swung open, and the human contingent walked in. The reaction was immediate. A wave of murmuring swept through the tiers like wind through tall grass. 12,000 beings shifting and leaning and turning to get a better look at the small group of figures crossing the vast stone floor. There were a few sounds that might have been laughter. The Chirix hive commander made a rapid clicking sound that its translator rendered as quiet amusement, and several Drenak exchanged grunts that needed no translation at all. Lyra Vasek walked at the center of her 8 soldiers with the same steady, unhurried pace she had maintained since stepping off her ship. She did not look up at the tiers of watching aliens. She did not scan the room for threats. She simply walked forward, her boots making soft sounds on the ancient stone, her hands clasped. Behind her back, her face carrying the same quiet expression that had unnerved the Sithari guard at the landing pad. She reached the center of the floor and stopped. Her soldiers stopped with her, all 8 of them halting at the same instant, in the same position, as if they shared a single nervous system. They stood in a loose ring around her, not quite at attention, but not quite relaxed either, occupying that precise middle ground that experienced soldiers found naturally, the state of being ready for anything without appearing to expect anything. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Tharok Vulcan rose from the apex throne. The motion was slow and deliberate, and it drew every eye in the chamber, because Tharok almost never stood during the rite. He conducted most assessments from his seat, and the act of rising was itself a statement. It meant he was either very impressed or very angry. Given the expression on his scaled face, it was not admiration, pp. He descended the steps of the platform with heavy, measured footfalls that sent vibrations through the stone floor. Each step a reminder that this being weighed nearly a metric ton and had killed 17 military leaders in personal combat. pp. He stopped 10 paces from Lyra and looked down at her. The size difference was almost absurd. He was more than twice her height and 5 times her mass, and his shadow fell over her like a blanket of darkness. "State your rank," he said. His voice was the deep subsonic rumble that Sithari used for formal address, and it was loud enough that several smaller species in the front tiers flinched. "Commander," Lyra said. Her voice was not loud, but the hall's acoustics were perfect, and every being in the chamber heard the word clearly. Tharok's eyes narrowed. "State your title," he said. "Commander Lyra Vasek, United Human Defense Force," she said. "State your conquests," he said. Tharok said, and now there was a dangerous edge in his voice. "Name the worlds that have fallen before you. Name the enemies whose bones you carry. Name the victories that give you the right to stand in this hall, before me, and before the assembled might of the Dominion." Lyra looked up at him. "I was not sent here to name conquests," she said. "I was sent here to represent my species." Tharok's frill rose, the full display this time, the one that Scythari used before violence, and the hall went very quiet. "You were sent here," Tharok said, and his voice had dropped to a register that most species could feel more than hear, "to present yourself as the supreme warrior of your kind. And you stand before me wearing the rank of a mid-level officer, with no visible honors, and no record of conquest, and you tell me you were not sent here to name victories." He leaned forward, his massive head coming close enough to Lyra that she could have reached out and touched. His jaw. "This is the right of standing," he said. "Rank is earned in blood, proven in fire, and held through fear. These are the laws of power that have governed this galaxy since before your species learned to walk upright." His golden eyes locked onto hers. "So I ask you one final time, human, what are you?" Lyra did not step back. She did not tilt her head or shift her weight or show any physical response to the 3-meter predator looming over her. "I am a commander," she said. "That is the rank my people chose to send, and if you want to understand why, you may ask them." Something shifted in Tharok's expression, a flicker of something that was not anger and not confusion, but lived somewhere between the two. Then it was gone, replaced by cold decision. He straightened to his full height, turned away from Lyra, and addressed the hall. "The human species has failed the right of standing," he declared, and his voice filled the chamber like thunder. "They have sent a delegate of insufficient rank, carrying no proof of military supremacy, and have thereby forfeited their claim to sovereign recognition." The hall erupted, not in shock, in excitement. Species that had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity began calling out immediately. The Drenak general stood and bellowed that his people would claim the human territories. The Kirik's hive commander clicked rapidly, submitting a formal vassal claim through the diplomatic channels. Even the Felnari Supreme Fang, normally too proud to scramble for scraps, leaned forward with interest, because human space was resource-rich and strategically positioned near 3 major trade routes. Lyra stood in the center of the chaos, motionless. Her soldiers had not moved either, 8 figures standing in their loose ring, their faces betraying nothing, their hands still nowhere near their weapons. 12,000 beings in the Grand Hall had been watching closely, truly closely. They might have noticed something strange. None of the humans looked afraid. None of them looked surprised. They looked like people who had expected exactly this, and who were waiting with a patience that went beyond training and into something deeper for what came next. And what came next started with the sound of small feet running across stone. The sound was small, barely audible under the roar of species shouting their claims, and the deep rumble of Tharok's voice still echoing off the domed ceiling. But it cut through the noise the way a crack cuts through ice, not because it was loud, but because it was wrong. Small feet on stone, moving fast, moving with the clumsy urgency of a child who had stopped listening to every rule it had been given. The Felnari cub burst from the crowd at the base of the lowest tier and stumbled onto the open floor of the Grand Hall. It was tiny, barely knee-height to most of the adults in the room, its golden fur still carrying the soft, unfinished quality of youth, its oversized amber eyes wide and fixed on a single point. Lyra Vasek. The cub's parent, the junior diplomatic aide, made a strangled sound of horror and lunged after the child. But the cub was already too far out, already past the point where grabbing it back could be done without creating an even larger scene. A Sithari guard moved to intercept, but the cub was fast, in the way all young Felnari were fast, low to the ground and unpredictable, and it darted past the guard's reaching hand like water flowing around a stone. The shouting in the hall began to falter, as beings noticed the small golden shape running across the central floor. One by one, voices dropped away. The Drenak generals stopped mid-bellow. The Kirik's hive commander's clicking slowed and then ceased. Tharok himself turned, his massive head tracking the movement with the reflexive attention of a predator, and his golden eyes found the cub just as it stumbled to a stop 5 paces from Lyra. The hall was not yet silent, but it was getting there, a rolling wave of quiet spreading outward from the center, as more and more beings saw the tiny Felnari standing alone on the vast stone floor, staring up at the human woman. The cub was trembling, not with fear, or not only with fear. It was trembling the way a tuning fork trembles when struck, vibrating with something that came from deep inside its biology, something it had no words for and no way to control. Its fur was standing on end, from the tips of its ears to the base of its small tail. Its pupils were blown wide, so wide that the amber of its irises was almost gone, replaced by deep black pools that reflected the light of the hall's ceremonial torches. Its mouth was open, and its breath was coming in short, shallow pants. And then it spoke. The word was barely a whisper. the soft, high voice of a child who was not trying to address a hall of 12,000, but was simply saying out loud what every cell in its small body already knew. She's Alpha. The hall's acoustics were built to carry the voices of generals and warlords to every corner of the massive chamber, and they had no way to distinguish between the roar of a 3-meter Scytheri, the whisper of a Felnari cub. Words reached every ear, every translator, every listening device in the room. And the grand hall of ascension went silent, not quiet, silent. The kind of silence that has weight, that presses against the skin and fills the lungs, and makes the small hairs on the back of the neck stand up. The kind of silence that falls when every being in a room realizes at the same instant that something fundamental has just shifted beneath their feet. Because every species in the Dominion knew what the Felnari were. The Felnari had evolved as pack predators on a world where the hierarchy of power determined everything. Who ate first, who mated, who lived, who died. Over millions of years, their biology had developed the most sophisticated instinctive dominance assessment system in the known galaxy. Adult Felnari could read the social hierarchy of any group of beings within seconds of entering a room. Dominant, who was submissive, who was dangerous, who was pretending to be dangerous but was actually weak. But adult Felnari had also learned to mask their readings, to keep their assessments private for political and social reasons, to smile and nod at a general they instinctively knew was a coward. To show deference to a leader their biology screamed was inferior. Cubs could not do this. Felnari cubs, before socialization taught them the art of diplomatic lying, were raw, unfiltered instruments of biological truth. Their readings were involuntary. They could not fake them, could not suppress them, could not be trained or bribed or threatened into giving a false assessment. And in the entire recorded history of the Galactic Dominion, spanning tens of thousands of years and countless interactions between species, a Felnari cub's instinctive reading had never once been wrong. Never. Not once. And this cub had just called Lyra Vasek, a small, undecorated human woman in a plain dark uniform, the word that the Felnari reserved for the single most dangerous being in any given space. Not dominant, not strong, not threatening. Alpha. The one that everything else defers to, not because it demands deference, but because the alternative is not something any survival instinct will allow. The Felnari ambassador Tessara, the same one who had joked about what kind of absurd creature the humans would send, felt her fur rise along her spine in a wave she could not control. Around her, every Felnari in the hall, warriors, diplomats, aides, all of them, dropped their gaze. They did not choose to do this. Their bodies did it for them, the same way a hand pulls back from a hot surface before the brain registers pain. Their ancient instincts recognized what the cub had declared, and those instincts would not allow them to hold eye contact with the being at the center of the floor. Tharok Vulcan stood frozen. For 80 years he had held the highest military position in the galaxy, and in all that time he had never felt what he felt now. A cold, unfamiliar sensation at the base of his skull that his species had not needed to feel in generations. It took him a moment to recognize it. It was the instinct of a predator that had just realized it might not be the largest thing in the room. He looked at the cub. Then he looked at Lyra. She had not moved. Her expression had not changed. Her hands were still clasped behind her back. Her breathing was still steady. And her eyes, dark and calm, were looking back at him with the same quiet patience she had worn since she entered the hall. A dozen species were already pulling up records on their personal devices, searching for information about this human, searching for anything that would explain what the cub had just declared. What they found did not help. It made things worse. Lyra Vasek held the rank of commander. because humanity did not send generals to events that were not wars. She had been offered the rank of general 14 times over the course of her career. She had declined every single time. Her military record was sparse, and not because it was empty. Most of it was classified at a level that the galactic intelligence community could not even confirm existed. The campaigns she was publicly linked to read like the kind of stories that career soldiers told each other in whispers, when they were very drunk and very sure no one important was listening. An insurgency on a colony world that had resisted pacification for 11 years ended in a single night after Vasek arrived, with 0 casualties on either side. A hostile first contact situation with a previously unknown predator species resolved without a single shot fired, the predator species requesting alliance terms within 72 hours. A planetary siege by a coalition of 3 hostile powers, outnumbering the human defenders 40-1, broken in 9 hours, with the besieging fleet withdrawing voluntarily after what the after-action reports described only as a conversation. She had never lost. She had never needed anyone to know what she was. From the back of the hall, a deep voice broke the silence. Uranthu, the Velandri ambassador, stepped forward, and the crowd parted before him the way water parts before the bow of a great ship. "I told you," he said, and his voice was not loud, but it filled the chamber the way deep water fills a canyon. "I met a human commander once, a long time ago." He looked at Tharok. "The humans have a saying," Uranthu said, "and I have carried it with me for a very long time, because I have never heard anything more true." Every being in the hall was listening. "The loudest one in the room," Uranthu said, "is the weakest one in the room." He let the words settle. Then he looked at Lyra, and the ancient Velandri did something that no one in the Grand Hall had ever seen a being of his stature do before. He inclined his great head, just slightly, just enough, in a gesture of recognition, and the silence in the hall grew deeper. Tharok, Volkan, had ruled the Grand Hall for 80 years, and in all that time he had never been uncertain. Uncertainty was a luxury that apex predators could not afford. It slowed the killing strike. It opened gaps in defense. It invited challengers who could smell hesitation the way scavengers smelled blood. He had built his entire existence on the elimination of doubt. He had killed 17 commanders in sanctioned duels, not because he enjoyed killing, though he did not mind it, but because each kill was a statement carved in bone that said there was no room for question about who stood at the top. And now, for the first time in 80 years, Tharok Volkan did not know what to do. He stood on the floor of the Grand Hall, 12,000 beings watching him in a silence so complete that he could hear the hum of the station's atmospheric processors through 3 meters of solid stone. And he looked at the small human woman in front of him, and tried to find the threat. He had been looking for it since she walked in. He had looked for it in her body, but she was small and soft and carried no weapons. He had looked for it in her soldiers, but they were calm and still and showed no signs of aggression. He had looked for it in her rank, but she carried a title so modest it would have been an insult if it had come from any other species. And now a Felnari cub, the most honest biological instrument the galaxy had ever produced, had told him that this woman was the most dangerous being in the room, a room that contained him. Tharok searched her face again, and this time he did not look for the threat the way a soldier looks for a weapon or a hunter looks for claws. He looked the way a predator looks at the landscape when something is wrong, but it cannot identify why. When the forest is too quiet, when the wind carries a scent that does not match anything in memory. Instinct says leave, but the conscious mind cannot find a reason. And he saw it, not in her body, in her stillness. Lyra Vasek was not being brave. Bravery was something beings displayed when they were afraid, but chose to act anyway. It showed in the tension of muscles, in the slight elevation of heart rate, in the micro-expressions that even the best-trained soldiers could not fully suppress. There was none of that. She was not suppressing fear. She was not controlling her response. She simply was not afraid. And it was not the absence of fear that comes from ignorance, from not understanding the danger. She understood the danger perfectly. Her eyes told him that, the way they tracked his movements with the casual precision of someone who had assessed his threat level the moment she entered the room, and filed it under a category that did not require her full attention. She was not afraid, the way a star is not afraid of the dark. The concept simply did not apply. Tharok felt something shift inside him, deep, tectonic, the kind of shift that changes the shape of a landscape and cannot be reversed. He had spent 80 years building a hierarchy of power based on display, on size and strength and roaring dominance, on bones worn as trophies and kills tallied like currency. And this small human had walked into the center of that hierarchy and revealed its deepest flaw without saying a single aggressive word. The flaw was this: everything Tharok had built required the other beings in the room to be impressed. It required them to see his size and feel small. It required them to hear his voice and feel fear. It required them to look at the bones on his chest and imagine their own bones hanging there instead. And Lyra Vasek was not impressed. She was not small or afraid or imagining anything. She was just there, present and calm, and waiting. Waiting had more gravity than his roaring ever had. Tharok spoke, and his voice was different now, quieter, stripped of the ceremonial thunder, carrying the raw tone of a being asking a question it actually wanted answered. "Why did your people send you?" Lyra looked up at him, and for the first time, something shifted in her expression. Not softness exactly, but the slight easing of a guard that had been held so naturally it was invisible until it moved. "Because I was enough," she said. "That is not an answer," Tharok said. "It is the only answer that matters," Lyra said. "My people learned a very long time ago that the ones who need to show their power have already lost it." She paused, not for drama, not for effect, but the way someone pauses when they want the next words to land with their full weight. "You demanded rank," she said. "My people sent you something better. They sent you the person who does not need one." Stared at her. The silence in the hall was so deep now that beings in the upper tiers could hear their own heartbeats. And then Tharok Volkan, Apex Marshal of the Galactic Dominion, holder of the Apex Throne for 80 unbroken years, killer of 17 champions, the most powerful military leader the galaxy had known in living memory, did something that no one had ever seen him do. He stepped to the side. It was not a bow. It was not a gesture of submission or surrender. It was something far more significant. A lateral movement, a clearing of the path, the kind of motion a being makes when it recognizes that the creature in front of it occupies a space that exists outside the hierarchy entirely. Not above him, not below him. Outside the system altogether, in a place where the rules he had built his life on simply did not reach. Lyra looked at him for a moment, and something passed between them that 12,000 watching beings understood, could feel, but none of them could name. Then she nodded, once, a small downward motion of her head that carried more respect than 1,000 salutes, and walked forward. Her soldiers fell into step around her, and together they crossed the floor of the grand hall toward the registration platform, where a Shirix clerk sat behind a console, its compound eyes wide, and its segmented fingers trembling over the input keys. The clerk looked at Lyra. It looked at its console. It looked back at Lyra. "Species designation, human," Lyra said. "Representative, Commander Lyra Vasek." The clerk's fingers hovered over the keys. "Standing classification," the clerk said. and its voice was a thin, reedy sound that the translator rendered as barely above a whisper. It was asking what category to file humanity under: sovereign, allied, vassal, subordinate, or one of a dozen other classifications that the Dominion used to sort the galaxy into a hierarchy of power. Lyra said nothing. She simply waited. The clerk looked past her at Tharok, who had not moved from where he stood, and who said nothing, and then at Uranthu, who inclined his great head in the smallest of nods, and then at the Felnari ambassador Tessara, whose fur was still standing on end, and whose eyes were fixed on the floor. The clerk understood. Its trembling fingers moved over the keys, and it entered a classification that had never been used before in the entire history of the Dominion's records. Standing, acknowledged. Rank, unnecessary. The delegation exited through the same gates they had entered, and the Grand Hall watched them go, in the same silence that had held since a small golden cub had whispered 2 words and changed everything. Near the base of the lowest tier, the Felnari cub was pressed against its parent's leg, held close by a trembling arm. The parent looked down at the child, with an expression caught between terror and awe, and the desperate need to understand. "How did you know?" the parent whispered. The cub looked up with its enormous amber eyes, honest, unguarded, holding the simple clarity that only the very young possess, before the world teaches them to doubt what their senses tell them. "She smelled like the thing that everything else is afraid of," the cub said. It paused, and its small face scrunched in the way children's faces do when they are trying to express something their vocabulary has not yet grown large enough to hold. "But she was nice about it," the cub finished. Outside the Grand Hall, aboard the human ship, the ramp sealed shut and the cabin pressurized with a soft hiss. One of Lyra's soldiers, the tall man with gray at his temples, a major named Rennick, who had served with her for 11 years, let out a long, slow breath that he seemed to have been holding since they entered the atmosphere. "I thought he was going to start a fight," Rennick said. Lyra sat down in the command chair, and for the first time since they had arrived on Tyrannus Prime, she let the tension leave her shoulders. It was a small movement, a slight drop, a loosening of muscles that had been held in perfect, controlled stillness for hours. But Rennick saw it, and it reminded him that she was human after all. "He was never going to fight," Lyra said quietly. She looked out the viewport at the Grand Hall receding below them as the ship lifted off. "The dangerous ones never do," she said. "They just needed to see that we knew that too." Rennick watched her for a moment, then shook his head with the faint smile of a man who had long ago stopped being surprised by her, and had never once stopped being amazed. The ship climbed through the atmosphere of Tyrannus Prime, and broke through into the black silence of open space. Behind them, in the Grand Hall of Ascension, 12,000 beings from 42 species sat in a new kind of silence, not the shocked silence of the cub's whisper, and not the tense silence of Tharok's challenge, but something quieter and deeper and more permanent. The silence of 42 civilizations realizing, all at once and all together, that the galaxy had just gotten a little more complicated. And somewhere in the vastness of that galaxy, on a small blue world orbiting an ordinary yellow star, 6 billion humans went about their lives without knowing that the universe had just learned their name. It would not forget.